The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning when the rain against my apartment window sounded like accusation. I hadn't thought about the Himalayas in 7 years, not consciously anyway, though they visited my dreams with the regularity of a wound that never quite heals. The paper was yellowed, creased, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something else I couldn't name, something that pulled at a memory I'd spent years trying to bury. My hands trembled as I turned it over, recognizing immediately the careful, deliberate script of someone who wrote as if each word might be their last. Inside, just 3 sentences in English, followed by a string of coordinates, and at the bottom, a name that stopped my heart. Pemba Sherpa. The man who had carried my equipment up those merciless slopes, who had pulled me from a crevasse when my obsession had nearly killed me, who had looked at me with something like pity when I'd sworn never to return. "I am dying," the letter began. "I have what you came for. Come now, or the truth dies with me." I set the letter on my desk and watched it like it might catch fire. Around me, my apartment had become a mausoleum to abandoned purpose. Dusty journals, boxed-up equipment, framed photographs I'd turned face down years ago. I'd remade myself after that last expedition, became something manageable, something that didn't chase shadows up the spine of the world. I consulted for nature documentaries now, fact-checked books about common species, lived a life of careful domesticity that asked nothing of me except that I forget. But Pemba's words had teeth. Irrefutable proof. The phrase circled in my mind like a prayer or a curse, and I realized with a sinking certainty that I'd been waiting for. This moment, since the day I'd descended from those mountains, empty-handed and hollowed out. The scientific community had been kind in their dismissal, calling my passion admirable, while quietly removing me from serious consideration. I'd published nothing. I'd proven nothing. I'd become a cautionary tale told in university hallways about the danger of losing objectivity. That night I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop seeing Pemba's face in the darkness, weathered and knowing, holding secrets behind his quiet smile. Why now? Why me? I'd met dozens of researchers over the years, people still chasing the myth with fresh conviction and better funding. But he'd written to me, sent coordinates. To me, offered his deathbed confession to the man who had failed so completely. The questions multiplied in the silence, each one a thread, pulling me back toward a place I'd sworn was finished with me. I thought about the footprints I'd photographed that had turned out to be bears, the eyewitness accounts that evaporated under scrutiny, the nights I'd spent in the cold, convinced I'd heard something moving just beyond my tent, only to find nothing in the morning light but wind-sculpted snow. I'd gone to the Himalayas a believer and returned a ghost, haunted not by what I'd found, but by the crushing weight of what I hadn't. By dawn, I'd already booked the flight. My hands moved with a will, separate from my conscious mind, pulling old equipment from storage, checking batteries in devices I'd thought I'd never use again. Something had shifted in the architecture of my carefully constructed denial. Perhaps it was the specificity of Pemba's claim, the strange formality of his summons, or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps I'd never really left those mountains at all, had only been waiting in the lowlands for permission to return. As I packed, I caught my reflection in the window, backlit by the grey morning, and barely recognized the man staring back. 7 years had passed. But the person who descended in defeat and the person now preparing to ascend again felt separated by more than time. I was returning to the Himalayas not as a scientist seeking validation, but as something else entirely, a summoned thing, answering a call I didn't fully understand. And in the pit of my stomach, beneath the anxiety and rekindled hope, lived a small, dark certainty that whatever Pemba had found, whatever truth he'd been guarding, would demand from me a price far greater than failure ever had. The village clung to the mountainside like a prayer spoken in stone and timber, smaller than I remembered, more weathered by the 7 years that had carved their passage through my own life as well. The bus had left me at the last possible point where combustion engines still made sense, and I'd walked the final hours with my pack cutting familiar grooves into shoulders that had gone soft with lowland living. Prayer flags snapped overhead in wind that tasted of snow and distance. Their colors faded to whispers of what they'd been, and I felt the altitude immediately, that particular thinness of air that makes every breath a conscious act of will. The tea house where I'd stayed before was gone, replaced by newer construction that somehow looked older, as if the mountain aged everything that dared plant roots in its soil. I asked for Pemba at 3 different establishments before anyone would meet my eyes, and when they did, what I saw there wasn't grief, but something closer to fear, a watchfulness that made the hair on my neck rise in recognition of rhythms I'd forgotten existed. The village elder finally agreed to speak with me as the sun dropped behind the western peaks, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow that felt like memory made visible. We sat in his home while his wife poured tea with hands gnarled as mountain roots, and he studied me with eyes that had witnessed decades of travelers passing through, chasing dreams the mountain rarely validated. "Pemba Tenzin," he said, speaking the full name with a reverence that confirmed my fears. "Left 3 weeks ago, said he was going to the old trails, the forbidden places. We tried to stop him. He was sick, very sick, but he said someone had to prepare the way." The elder's pause stretched long enough that I heard wind finding gaps in the wooden walls, a sound like breathing. "He didn't come back. We sent search parties, but the passes—" He made a gesture that encompassed futility and fate in equal measure. "You are the one he spoke of, the scientist who listens." Something in how he said that last word suggested it meant more than I understood, carried weight beyond its simple syllables. "The people here, we have new stories now. Old ones too, but new ones since the last moon. Things seen in the high places, sounds in the night that aren't wind or animal, but something between." His wife spoke then, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves might betray her confidence to whatever listened in the darkness gathering outside. "My cousin's son guides trekkers. 2 weeks ago, on the approach to the North Sanctuary, he found tracks, not bear, not snow leopard. He knows these. In things since childhood, understands the language the mountain speaks through its creatures. These were different. Walking upright, stride too long, pressed too deep for the snow's consistency." She glanced at her husband, seeking permission to continue, and he nodded with visible reluctance. He photographed them, but his camera malfunctioned. All the images corrupted except one, and in that one, she made a sign I didn't recognize, fingers moving in a pattern that might have been protection or prayer. In that one, you could see where something had stopped, turned around, and stood watching back toward where he'd been standing, like it knew. Like it had waited for him to catch up, then decided he wasn't ready. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, or perhaps it was just the way fear moves through a space, displacing warmth with its passage. The elder leaned forward, and his next words carried the weight of warning, wrapped in hospitality's careful courtesy. "Pemba said you would come. He left something for you, a map. Supplies cached at the old staging post, but he also left a message, and I will tell you what he told us to tell you." He paused, choosing his words with the precision of someone translating between not just languages, but entire ways of understanding the world. He said, "Some truths are kept buried in ice, not because they are lies, but because they are too true, too sharp, and the world is not ready for that kind of cutting." He said the mountains have kept their covenant for longer than our people have had words, and breaking that silence has a price that cannot be unpaid. Outside, full darkness had fallen, and somewhere distant I heard what might have been rocks falling, or might have been something else entirely, a sound that resonated in frequencies that bypassed my ears and went straight to some older part of my brain that still remembered when humans were prey. I thought about turning back, about catching the next bus down to where the air was thick and explanations came easy, but Pemba's letter had already rewritten something fundamental in me, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would follow those coordinates into whatever waited in the forbidden places, because some summons cannot be refused without losing the part of yourself that makes refusal meaningful. The map Pemba left guided me beyond the last official trails, past the cairns that marked where rescue helicopters would bother searching, into territory the government had designated restricted for reasons that shifted depending on who you asked. Ecological preservation, military sensitivity, sacred indigenous grounds. 3 days of climbing brought me to elevations where my thoughts came slow and thick as the blood struggling through constricted vessels, where each step required negotiation between will and physiology. The trail markers weren't the bright paint of modern hiking routes, but ancient stone arrangements, subtle as whispers, that required me to think like someone for whom these mountains weren't obstacles, but home, language, cathedral. I almost missed the first one. Would have. Walked right past if a shift in cloud cover hadn't angled sunlight across the weathered rock in a way that revealed deliberate patterning beneath lichens centuries old. Once I learned to see them, they appeared at intervals so precise they suggested not just knowledge, but ongoing maintenance, someone or something still tending these paths long after mapmakers had declared these regions impassable. The arrangement spoke of geometry that predated the trails by uncountable years, alignments that suggested whoever placed them understood the mountain's moods with intimate precision, knew exactly where snow would accumulate and where wind would scour stone clean, preserving their silent directions through seasons beyond counting. I found the first footprint in a protected hollow where yesterday's snowfall had settled in pristine uniformity, unmarked except for this single impossible testimony. My rational mind catalogued the facts with clinical detachment even as something deeper recoiled in recognition of wrongness, of categories violated. The print measured nearly 18 inches long, showed 5 distinct toes with a flexibility that suggested both power and dexterity pressed into snow with a depth that indicated massive weight distributed across a stride. I had to stretch my legs fully to match. I'd spent years studying primate locomotion, could identify species from gait patterns and pressure distributions. But this defied every classification I'd memorized, showed characteristics that shouldn't coexist in a single creature. The ball of the foot was pronounced like a human's, adapted for bipedal efficiency, but the toes showed a spread and articulation that spoke of gripping, climbing, uses we'd bred out of our feet when we committed fully to terrestrial life. I photographed it from every angle, with hands that trembled not from cold, but from the adrenaline surge that accompanies paradigm collapse, then followed the trail until it led to a rock face, where the prints simply ended, as if whatever made them had stepped directly into stone, or perhaps climbed with such surety that it left no mark on vertical surfaces. The alternative, that something this large could move up sheer granite with such grace, opened possibilities my scientific training insisted were impossible, while my racing heart whispered might be true. The cave mouth revealed itself only when I stood at a specific angle, a narrow opening concealed by an overhang that would be completely invisible from above or below, positioned with either remarkable luck or deliberate architectural understanding. Inside, the passage opened into a chamber where daylight filtered through cracks in ways that suggested deliberate engineering, illumination without exposure, and the walls bore markings that stopped my breath entirely in my chest. Sanskrit, or something ancestral to it, covered the stone in precise columns, each character carved with a depth and clarity that had survived centuries of temperature fluctuation that should have fractured such detailed work into illegibility. I could read enough to catch fragments, guardians, before the speaking peoples, covenant of silence, walked between worlds, phrases that tangled history with myth in ways that made my academic training feel suddenly inadequate, built on foundations that were perhaps incomplete. But it was the pictographs interspersed with the text that truly unmade me, figures rendered with an artistic sophistication that suggested long observation, intimate knowledge rather than fearful imagination. They showed beings upright as humans, but broader, more powerful, interacting with smaller figures in scenes that depicted not conflict, but something closer to instruction, transmission, the passing of knowledge from teacher to student rendered in stone that predated written history. In one panel, the larger figures appeared to be pointing towards star patterns still visible in the night sky, configurations I recognized from navigation charts, suggesting astronomical knowledge that should not have existed when these carvings were made, unless the makers were not who I'd assumed, unless the teachers and students were positioned differently than my civilizational bias had automatically placed them. I sat in that cave as afternoon surrendered to evening, as the quality of light filtering through stone fissures shifted from gold to amber to the deep blue that precedes darkness, and felt something fundamental, restructuring in my understanding not just of cryptozoology, but of history itself, of humanity's story, and the convenient erasures we'd committed to maintain our narrative of inevitable supremacy. These mountains held archives written in stone and silence, testimonies to parallel paths, to choices made differently, to intelligence that had looked. At the fork where civilization beckoned and deliberately chosen the other direction, valued something we'd abandoned in our rush towards cities and agriculture, and the particular loneliness of crowds. The footprints outside weren't evidence of a missing link or evolutionary dead end, but of a living alternative, consciousness that had watched us build and burn and build again, that had maintained their ancient covenant while we forgot such agreements were even possible. Pemba had known, had been entrusted with this knowledge, and now he'd passed it to me like a burden and a gift, impossibly intertwined. And sitting in that darkening cave, I understood for the first time why some truths were buried in ice, because knowing them required you to question everything you'd built your identity upon, demanded you acknowledge that the story you'd been telling about progress and dominion might be just one interpretation, and perhaps not the wisest one these mountains had witnessed. The avalanche came with the sound of gods rearranging furniture, a roar that bypassed ears and spoke directly to the animal brain through bone conduction, through the sudden certainty that the mountain had decided something and your opinion on the matter held no weight whatsoever. I'd been traversing a narrow ridge when the snowpack above released, centuries of accumulated weight achieving critical mass in an instant, and I had perhaps 3 seconds to register the white wall, descending before survival instinct launched me sideways toward an outcrop that might provide shelter or might simply mark where they'd eventually find my body. The world became violence rendered in white, a tumbling chaos where direction lost meaning and lungs burned, with the effort of not inhaling the granular cascade that sought every opening, every vulnerability. Then stillness, profound and ringing, and I was somehow breathing, somehow intact, but the landscape had been completely rewritten. The ridge I'd been following erased, the route back obliterated, and before me a valley that shouldn't exist. According to the topographical maps I'd memorized, a hidden geography cradled between peaks like a secret the mountain had suddenly decided to share. The light there felt different, thicker somehow, as if the air itself had weight and memory, and my watch insisted only minutes had passed, but my body registered hours, displacement not just in space, but in some quality of time itself that made my physicist friends' theories about relativity suddenly feel inadequate to what these mountains contained. I saw it first as movement against stillness, a shape emerging from the tree line with a gait that rewrote my understanding of bipedal locomotion, not the lumbering shuffle popular culture had assigned to such creatures, but motion of unsettling grace, economy, and power integrated so completely they became indistinguishable, each step placed with the certainty of complete environmental awareness. Through the scope I'd salvaged from my pack, I watched it pause and turn its massive head directly toward my position, despite the impossible. Distance and my complete stillness, an acknowledgement that sent ice through my chest that had nothing to do with altitude and everything to do with the recognition that I was not observing but being observed, assessed, that the scientific distance I'd maintained my entire career was an illusion and always had been. The creature moved laterally, across the valley floor, but the pattern wasn't random. It would pause at specific locations, turn back toward where I crouched, wait, then move to the next position. And with dawning astonishment, I realized it was marking a path, showing me something, engaging not in animal behavior, but in something closer to instruction, communication across a species barrier I'd assumed was absolute. When it finally stopped and settled into stillness beside a rock formation, waiting with what could only be described as patience, I understood that the next move was mine, that I'd been invited into a dialogue whose rules I didn't yet understand, but whose significance resonated through every cell, still, thrumming with the adrenaline of near death and impossible survival. The descent into the valley felt like moving between states of being, each step taking me further from the world where peer review and academic credentials mattered and deeper into older contracts, ancient protocols my DNA remembered, even if my conscious mind had forgotten. As I drew closer, details resolved that my distant observation had missed. The creature's fur wasn't uniform, but showed patterns that shifted in the changing light, disruptive coloration that would render it nearly invisible against stone and snow despite its immense size, evolutionary artistry that spoke of survival pressures lasting millennia. Its face, glimpsed in profile as it tracked my approach, wasn't the bestial mask of reconstruction drawings, but something that stopped my breath. A countenance that held depth, consideration, intelligence, unmistakable in the set of features that were neither human nor ape, but some third option the taxonomies didn't contain, had never made room for. When our eyes finally met directly, perhaps 20 feet apart, I felt recognition pass between us, not the startled acknowledgement of predator and prey, but something closer to what happens when you encounter someone who speaks your native language in a foreign land, a shock of unexpected kinship. It made a gesture then, slow and deliberate, raising one massive hand palm outward in a sign that needed no translation, the universal grammar of peaceful intention. And I found myself mirroring it without thought, some part of me understanding that we were establishing protocols, agreeing to terms, engaging in diplomacy between nations of consciousness that had existed in parallel isolation. Until this moment, the mountain had arranged. We remained like that as light shifted across the hidden valley, as clouds rearranged themselves in configurations that felt almost purposeful, and I became aware of layers of communication happening beyond language, the angle of its shoulders relaxing incrementally, my own breathing steadying to match. Some rhythm it was establishing, a synchronization that anthropologists had documented in bonding primates, but which felt here like something more profound, older. A recognition that consciousness came in forms we'd been too narrow to acknowledge. When it finally turned and began walking toward the rock formation, it paused after several steps and looked back, an invitation so clear that I followed without hesitation, without fear, understanding on some level beneath language that Pemba's letter had been more than information. It had been introduction, permission, the opening of a door that had been closed for longer than my civilization had names for. The covenant, the cave inscriptions mentioned wasn't abstract history, but living practice, maintained through precisely such encounters, carefully selected witnesses who would be changed by what they saw, who would carry the knowledge forward wrapped in the humility of knowing they'd been chosen not for their credentials, but for their capacity to be transformed, remade by truth into something neither purely scientist nor purely believer, but a third thing for which we also lacked adequate names. The monastery revealed itself not as ruin, but as intentional abandonment. Structures still sound, but emptied with the care of planned departure. Butter lamps positioned, as if the monks expected to return momentarily, though dust. and patterns suggested decades of stillness. The creature had led me to the entrance then, withdrawn to the tree line, watching as I approached the heavy wooden doors that opened with surprising ease, their hinges maintained by mountain air so dry it prevented rust, preserved everything in a state between life and death. Inside, the main prayer hall held silence that felt textured, layered, as if centuries of chanting had soaked into the stone and now leaked back in frequencies just below hearing. And arranged on a single altar were objects that didn't belong. Leather journals bound in European style, a brass sextant, photographic equipment from an era when cameras were furniture-sized. Commitments. My hands trembled as I opened the first journal, recognizing the date inscribed on the frontispiece. April 7th, 1924, and a name that sent electricity through my chest because I knew it, had seen it referenced in footnotes of footnotes. Captain Marcus Whitmore of the Royal Geographic Society, leader of an expedition that had vanished so completely that most historians assumed the records of its existence were clerical errors, conflations of other failed attempts to map these ranges. The entries began with the familiar cadence of colonial exploration. Observations rendered in clipped military precision, measurements of altitude and temperature, sketches of flora labeled with the confident ignorance of men who believed naming things granted mastery over them. But the tone shifted dramatically after the notation for May 3rd, the handwriting growing more urgent, the scientific detachment crumbling into something between exhilaration and terror. Contacted the subjects today, must revise. Everything. They are not specimens. God help us, they are not specimens. The pages that followed documented a transformation similar to my own, Whitmore's expedition stumbling into encounters with the creatures he called guardians, his initial attempts at collection and classification giving way to horrified understanding that he'd approached sentient beings with the ethics of butterfly pinning. He described meetings that occurred in patterns, always at dawn, always initiated by the creatures, always in locations that held significance he struggled to decode. His sketches showed cave systems marked with symbols, stone arrangements that served purposes beyond shelter, evidence of culture, ritual, continuity of practice that stretched beyond the margins his journals could contain. And then, dated June 15th, an entry that made my breath catch. They showed us the chamber today. Dalton wept. Morrison has stopped speaking entirely. We cannot unsee what we have witnessed. The covenant is not request, but necessity. Knowledge carries moral weight that crushes those unprepared to bear it properly. The remaining journals detailed Whitmore's crisis of conscience, his expedition fragmenting as members chose different responses to their discovery, some advocating immediate publication, others arguing for secrecy, the group fracturing along fault lines that revealed character in its rawest form. 2 members had attempted to leave with photographic evidence and were found frozen 3 days later, not murdered, but lost, the mountains reclaiming them with the indifference of natural law. Whitmore made the choice that explained why his expedition vanished from record. He negotiated the covenant, an agreement with the Guardians, that knowledge of their existence would be protected by a succession of witnesses, individuals who would encounter the truth, be transformed by it, and choose silence, reinforced by occasional guidance, steering humanity away from the hidden valleys through subtle interventions in mapping projects, conservation, boundaries, climbing permits. He listed his predecessors, names spanning centuries, cultures, languages, a secret society bound not by ritual or hierarchy, but by shared burden, the terrible privilege of knowing what must be protected, even as the protection required complicity in humanity's ignorance. The final entry, dated September 9th, 1924, held just one line in handwriting that wavered with exhaustion or emotion. I return to London tomorrow, already mourning the man I was before the mountains taught me the difference between discovery and desecration. I sat in that abandoned hall as light failed outside, understanding with crystalline clarity that Pemba had read these same journals, had been brought to this same crossroads, where knowing became choosing, where the gift of truth arrived, wrapped in the responsibility of silence. The creature still waited at the tree line, visible through gaps in the wooden walls, patient as stone, and I realized it wasn't guarding me, but grieving with me, witnessing my transition. From seeker to keeper, celebrating nothing because there was nothing to celebrate, only the perpetual burden of standing between what is and what must not yet be. The covenant renewed in my trembling hands as darkness transformed the valley into a place where past and present collapsed into. The creature emerged from the tree line at dawn, its approach signaling a transition I felt in my sternum before understanding intellectually, the air itself seeming to thicken with significance as the being moved with that unsettling grace that married power to restraint, each footfall deliberate as prayer. It stopped 3 meters distant, close enough that I could see the intelligence moving, behind eyes that reflected light with an amber quality that seemed less animal than elemental, and in the stillness between us, I felt the weight of choice collapsing into singular focus. This was the threshold Whitmore had crossed, the moment where witness became participant. The creature raised one massive hand, not in threat but in gesture, unmistakably communicative, a sweeping motion toward the mountainside that carried the clarity of language, though no words were spoken, and I understood with the certainty of instinct that I was being invited, not commanded, offered the chamber Whitmore had written of with such devastation. I gathered my equipment with hands that felt disconnected. From intention, the camera and carbon dating kit suddenly absurd instruments for measuring what was about to unfold. Tools from a paradigm that had already collapsed, though my body hadn't absorbed the lesson yet, still clung to the rituals of documentation as drowning men clutched debris, following the guardian up trails that existed more as intention than path. I registered details with the fragmented attention of overwhelm, how the creature moved with an economy that suggested absolute familiarity with terrain, how it paused at intervals to ensure I followed, how the landscape itself seemed to shift around our passage as if the mountains were active participants in this revelation, rather than passive setting. We climbed for what felt like hours, though the sun barely moved, time acquiring that viscous quality I'd experienced since the avalanche. And I wondered if the distortion was geographical phenomenon or perceptual shift, whether the hidden valley operated under physical laws that bent around the weight of what it contained. The creature led me to a cliff face that appeared solid until we stood directly before it, perspective resolving into narrow opening concealed by angular precision, a gap that would be invisible from any approach except the exact vector we'd traveled. And the guardian turned to face me fully for the first time, its expression unreadable, but its posture conveying something between solemnity and sorrow, the bearing of guides who lead others toward necessary wounds. It gestured toward the opening, then stepped aside, and I understood that this passage I would make alone, that whatever waited in the darkness required solitary witness, the covenant renewed individually, because some truths cannot be shared even in companionship. The chamber beyond swallowed my headlamp beam, space extending farther than light could reach. But as my eyes adjusted, I discerned shapes arranged with intentional precision, stone platforms holding forms wrapped in what appeared to be preserved hides, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, receding into shadows that suggested the chamber was less room than cathedral, vast and purposeful, and arranged according to logic that transcended storage or disposal. I approached the nearest platform with reverence that arose unbidden, some primitive recognition that I stood in sacred space. And when I pulled back, the hide covering my hands encountered not bone degraded by time, but remains in impossible preservation, flesh desiccated but intact, features recognizable as the face gazed upward with eye sockets holding the memory of sight. The skull showed the pronounced brow ridge and robust jaw of the guardian outside, but the skeleton was smaller, more gracile, and arranged around it were objects that spoke of individual identity, carved bone implements, shells that must have been carried from distant oceans, a necklace of worked stone beads that represented hours of labor transformed into adornment, beauty, meaning beyond survival. I moved between platforms in a trance of recognition, each body representing not specimen but person, individuals with lives and deaths, relationships and losses, the accumulated weight of lineage, preserved with care that bordered on worship, and I understood that this was not burial site, but sanctuary, the guardian people maintaining connection with their dead across generations in continuous ceremony of remembrance. My carbon dating equipment felt obscene in that space, reductive machinery designed to render mystery into number, but I performed the analysis with trembling precision because some part of me still clung to the paradigm of proof, needed the validation of measurement to accept what my soul already knew. The readings came back impossible, then consistent, then undeniable. The remains ranged from 8,000 years to less than 2 decades old, an unbroken chain of occupation stretching from deep prehistory to the present moment, and the most recent body was small, infant-sized, wrapped with particular care, and surrounded by offerings that suggested profound grief, the loss of future rather than past. I sat in that chamber as understanding detonated through my remaining assumptions. These were not relics of extinct hominids, but proof of continuous survival, a parallel branch of human evolution that had chosen differently at some ancient crossroads, embracing isolation and equilibrium while our ancestors pursued expansion and dominance, and they had persisted in that choice for millennia, actively hiding from our encroachment, protecting not just themselves, but the decision itself, the road not taken that we could no longer imagine traveling. The guardian outside had not led me to discovery, but to mirror, showing me what humanity had abandoned in our obsessive forward motion, and the grief I felt was not for their isolation, but for our orphaning. The poverty of having forgotten we were never meant to be alone at the top of the cognitive hierarchy, that intelligence flowers in forms we'd taught ourselves not to recognize. I emerged from the chamber into light that felt accusatory, the morning sun exposing me to judgment I could feel radiating from the guardian who waited with that terrible patience, posture unchanged, eyes tracking my exit with attention that weighed everything my body language revealed before consciousness could curate the telling. My equipment bag hung from my shoulder like evidence at trial, the carbon dating results stored in digital memory that suddenly felt volatile as unstable explosives, data that could detonate the carefully maintained equilibrium these beings had protected across millennia of deliberate erasure. The guardian moved then, not toward me but parallel, a gesture clearly meant for following, and we walked in silence that felt thick with unspoken consequence until we reached an overhang, where the hidden valley spread below, like a secret the mountains had kept pressed against their heart. What I saw destroyed my remaining categorizations, structures of wood and stone integrated so seamlessly with landscape they were nearly invisible, agricultural terraces that suggested not primitive subsistence but sophisticated understanding of seasonal cycles, and figures moving through morning routines with the ease of culture rather than survival. Children playing with laughter that carried up the slope, the unmistakable architecture of society rather than scattered remnants clinging to existence. These were not relics awaiting extinction, but a thriving community that had chosen invisibility over contact, maintained their separation with such discipline that our entire species believed them myth, and I understood with sickening clarity that what I carried in my bag was not discovery, but weapon, proof that could drag them from chosen obscurity into the consuming attention of a civilization that had never met mystery it didn't seek to capture, catalogue, and ultimately destroy through the violence of knowing. The guardian led me to a shelter at the valley's edge where more cave paintings covered the walls. But these were not ancient. I could smell the mineral pigment still fresh, see the continuation of visual language that stretched back centuries but remained. Living practice, story told and retold and added to with each generation's witness. The paintings showed the history I'd only glimpsed in fragments, their ancestors' deliberate withdrawal as human settlements expanded, the conscious decision to become legend rather than neighbor, the discipline of remaining hidden even when curiosity or compassion might have drawn them into contact, and the cost of that choice rendered in images of isolation, of watching from distances as our species spread like flood across landscapes they'd once traveled freely. But the recent paintings showed darker narrative, logging operations encroaching on buffer territories, mining surveys penetrating what had been remote sanctuaries, climate shifts altering the ecological patterns they'd adapted to across millennia, and in the final panel, rendered with pigments so fresh they might have been applied yesterday, an image of their valley discovered, overrun, the guardian people scattered or captured or vanished, the ending they'd evaded for 8,000 years finally arriving not through intention, but through our species' casual destruction of the margins, where alternative ways of being had persisted. The guardian touched this final painting with a gentleness that broke something in my chest, the gesture containing such resignation, such profound fatigue at the endless labor of hiding from neighbors who never stopped searching. And I realized this being was not showing me their history, but their predicted future. The outcome that my evidence would accelerate from possibility into inevitability. And the choice they were giving me was not about science, but about whether I would be the instrument of their apocalypse. Through gestures and drawings scraped into the shelter's dirt floor, the guardian communicated what language could not contain, how their people had developed consciousness along paths orthogonal to ours, valuing continuation over progress, stability over growth, how they'd watched our branch of humanity with mixture of fascination and horror as we chose expansion, regardless of cost, how they'd nearly made contact dozens of times across history, but always withdrew when they recognized we could not encounter difference without seeking to convert or consume it. They showed me the others who'd found them across centuries, explorers who'd been allowed to glimpse and then forget, scientists who'd been brought to chambers like the one I'd witnessed and made the choice I now faced, indigenous peoples who'd known about them always, but honored the separation as sacred obligation rather than ignorance demanding correction. The guardian drew figure after figure of these witnesses, then showed them returning to their world, carrying secret rather than proof, becoming protectors instead of discoverers. And I understood they were offering me induction into lineage of keepers, those who knew and chose silence, who carried the weight of unshared knowledge as service rather than burden. But the drawing showed something else too, how each generation of keepers became fewer, how the pressures of exposure intensified as our surveillance technologies penetrated deeper, how the mathematics of secrecy were approaching impossible threshold. And the terrible question implicit in every gesture. Was there any point to my silence when the valley would likely be discovered within my lifetime anyway, when satellite imaging and climate refugee migrations and resource extraction would eventually penetrate even this last sanctuary, when the best my secret-keeping could offer was delay rather than prevention? The guardian produced one final object from a leather pouch worn smooth with age. A journal I recognized immediately as belonging to Whitmore, the 1920s expedition leader whose writings I'd found in the monastery, but these were pages he'd never published, entries written after his return to civilization, and reading them felt like watching a man slowly drown in the implications of what he'd chosen. He described the weight of carrying their secret, how it infected every interaction with colleagues who pressed him for findings, how he'd destroyed his photographic plates one by one, each act of erasure feeling like small murder of truth he'd devoted his life to pursuing, how he'd died knowing the most significant discovery of his career would vanish with him, and how, despite the grief of that silencing, he never regretted the choice, because he'd seen in the Guardian people's eyes the recognition that some branches of the human family tree deserved to grow in darkness, protected from the burning attention our civilization directed at everything it touched. The final entry, written weeks before his death, contained a single line that seemed to pulse with prophetic weight. "I have kept their secret, but I fear I am the last who can, for the world has grown too small for mysteries, and what remains hidden now survives not through distance, but through our collective agreement to look away, and I do not believe that agreement will hold." I looked up from the journal to find the Guardian watching with expression I could finally read. Not hope for my silence, but simple witness. To my choosing, the recognition that whatever I decided would unfold according to patterns larger than individual will, and their people would face what came with the same deliberate grace they'd maintained for 8,000 years, would adapt or vanish or transform, but would not beg, would not compromise the dignity of their chosen path even at the threshold of its ending. The Guardian rose with a fluidity that still unsettled my primate brain's categories and gestured for me to follow once more, leading me along a narrow path carved into the valley's western cliff face, and with each step I felt the air grow colder, the quality of light shifting into something that made my equipment. Readings fluctuate wildly, as if we were approaching a place where normal physical laws held less authority. We emerged onto a plateau that shouldn't have existed at this elevation, a microclimate pocket where vegetation grew in patterns I'd never encountered, species that looked simultaneously ancient and impossible, and at the center stood a formation of stones arranged with clear intentionality, megaliths covered in more of those Sanskrit inscriptions, but also older markings that predated any writing system I recognized. The Guardian approached with movements that became ritual, touching each stone in sequence that created harmonics in the mountain wind, and other figures emerged. From the morning mist, 5 more of their people, each bearing themselves with the same presence that made creature feel like category error, like calling cathedral building or ocean water collection. They formed a circle around the stones and began what I can only describe as ceremony, vocalizations that resonated in my chest cavity, gestures that traced patterns in the air. And slowly I understood this wasn't performance for my benefit, but practice they'd maintained for longer than my civilization had existed, the tending of something I couldn't see, but could suddenly, terribly feel. The stones began to pulse with light that my rational mind wanted to dismiss as altitude, hallucination or oxygen deprivation. But my equipment registered it, cameras capturing luminescence that shouldn't exist, spectrometers showing readings that made no sense, and through the scientific impossibility I understood I was witnessing what they'd been protecting all along, not just their own existence but something far older, an ecological or spiritual or dimensional threshold that required constant guardianship, maintenance performed through ritual knowledge our branch of humanity had forgotten or never possessed. The Guardian people's vocalizations intensified, and I felt it then, a presence vast and patient pressing against reality, like deep ocean against submarine hull, something that existed in the spaces between what we'd decided was real, and I knew with certainty that bypassed intellect that this was what they'd withdrawn to protect, that their isolation had never been about hiding themselves, but about maintaining vigil over responsibility, so ancient its origins preceded both our species. One of the Guardians gestured to me, inviting participation, and with hands shaking from more than cold, I stepped forward and mimicked their movements, felt the patterns they traced activate something in the air around me, and suddenly I could see it. Vast networks of energy flowing through the mountain ranges like neural pathways, connections between peaks and valleys, and living systems, an architecture of balance that our infrastructure and extraction and casual violence were severing thread by thread, and the guardian people standing in this circle were suturing ruptures we didn't even know we were creating, holding together an ecological coherence that our civilization depended on while actively destroying. The vision intensified until I could see the scope of what our ignorance was dismantling: weather patterns that depended on these mountain sanctuaries, migration routes for species we'd never catalogued, fungal networks in the soil that connected forests across continents, and threaded through it all the presence of the guardian people, not as primitive remnants but as active maintainers, consciousness that had evolved not toward domination but toward stewardship, and their withdrawal hadn't been retreat but strategic positioning, placing themselves at crucial nodes where the work of preservation could continue unseen. I saw what would happen if they were discovered, not through malice but through simple contact, disease vectors they had no immunity to, legal frameworks that would demand their integration or relocation, scientific attention that would disrupt ritual practices they couldn't explain in terms our epistemology recognized, and within 3 generations the knowledge they carried would be gone, the ceremonies would cease, and the subtle maintenance they performed would end, and the mountains would forget how to hold together what our species' expansion was tearing apart. The guardian beside me placed a hand on my shoulder, the first direct touch we'd shared, and through that contact I felt the weight they carried, millennia of chosen responsibility, the loneliness of protecting those who would destroy you, and the question that had haunted them across centuries, whether preservation of balance justified their continued hiding, or whether witness demanded they emerge and face whatever came, martyr themselves trying to teach what we'd proven endlessly we had no capacity to learn. The ceremony ended and the light faded, and I stood on the plateau with evidence beyond refutation, my equipment full of readings that would revolutionize our understanding of consciousness and ecology and human origins, proof that would make my career legendary and doom the very beings who'd trusted me with their revelation. And I finally understood why the dying Sherpa had sent that letter, why the guardian people had allowed me to penetrate their sanctuary when they'd successfully evaded detection for 8,000 years. They were forcing the choice they could no longer make themselves, offering me the decision between truth and continuation, between my species' addiction to knowing and the survival of the last. Keepers of knowledge we'd forgotten was necessary. The guardians watched with that patient witness, not pleading but simply present, and I realized the evidence in my bag wasn't discovery, but diagnosis, documentation of what we were losing, and publication wouldn't save them, but would inscribe their existence and passing into our historical record would make their extinction visible rather than silent, and I didn't know if that visibility constituted honor or final violence. I looked across the valley at the community below, children playing games that had been passed down across millennia. Adults tending gardens that fed not just bodies, but sustained lineage, and understood that what I'd found wasn't missing link, but living alternative, proof that consciousness could evolve toward harmony instead of conquest. And the evidence I carried would either protect them through revelation or destroy them through exposure. And everything in their patient faces told me they'd already accepted they couldn't control which outcome my choice would birth. I descended from the plateau carrying equipment that held civilization-ending proof and heart-shattering responsibility, understanding finally why Tenzing Sherpa had written that letter in his dying days. He'd carried this burden for 63 years after his own encounter, maintaining silence while watching human expansion. Would creep closer to these hidden valleys, and in his final months the weight of soul guardianship had become unbearable. Not because he wanted to betray the covenant, but because he understood one consciousness couldn't hold this secret against the momentum of our species' relentless cataloguing. The guardian who'd shown me everything walked beside me, in silence that felt companionable rather than awkward, and I realized their people had debated this decision across years, perhaps decades, choosing finally to reveal themselves not from desperation, but from strategic assessment, that concealment alone could no longer guarantee survival, that the accelerating climate collapse and resource extraction would breach their sanctuary within a generation regardless, and calculated witness to a single scientist might prove less catastrophic than inevitable accidental discovery by mining surveys or military satellites. We reached the valley's edge, where avalanche debris blocked the path I'd entered through, and the Guardian produced a carved stone that matched descriptions in those 1920s journals, pressed it into my palm with gesture that conveyed both gift and burden, and through our weeks of proximity, I understood this wasn't artifact, but authentication. Proof I could show if needed, that would verify my account to those few who knew what to recognize, making me not discoverer, but designated messenger, translator between evolutionary branches whose divergence had become dangerous chasm. The Guardian led me through passages I'd never have found alone, shortcuts that suggested their people's knowledge of these mountains transcended mere familiarity and approached relationship, the way you know not just your home's layout, but its particular creeks and temperatures and moods, and we emerged 3 valleys distant from where I'd been trapped, in territory close enough to civilization that I could navigate back without their further guidance. Before departing, the Guardian performed one final gesture, touching my forehead, then their own, then the mountain peak above us. And I understood this was both blessing and binding, acknowledgement that I now carried piece of their truth and responsibility for its stewardship, that I'd been transformed from observer into participant, granted not just knowledge, but obligation that would shape every remaining choice of my life. They vocalized something that resonated in my chest like grief and gratitude combined, then turned and moved up the mountain with that impossible grace. And I watched until the snow and distance reclaimed them, feeling the loneliness Tenzing must have felt returning to a world that couldn't understand what he'd witnessed, couldn't hold the complexity of what he'd learned. And I finally grasped why he'd waited until dying to pass this burden forward, because living with it required strength that eventually even the strongest couldn't sustain alone. I stood at that threshold between their world and mine, equipment bag heavy with documentation that could vindicate every dismissed claim I'd ever made, restore the reputation I'd spent 15 years rebuilding after my first expedition's failure, give me platform and authority to speak truths that desperately needed speaking. And simultaneously I knew publication would be violation, would reduce their sacred complexity to data points, would invite exactly the attention and intervention that would destroy the delicate balance they'd maintained across millennia. The descent took 4 days, and I spent every night reviewing footage, examining readings, studying the stone the Guardian had gifted me, and conducting internal referendum that felt less like decision-making and more like discovering what I'd already chosen the moment I'd stepped into that ceremony circle and felt the vast architecture of maintenance they'd sustained while our civilization careened toward collapse. I understood that evidence served truth, but truth didn't always serve life, that some knowledge functioned best as secret not because it was false, but because its revelation would destroy the very thing it validated. And the Guardian people had shown me themselves not seeking documentation, but seeking ally, someone who could protect their sanctuary through different means than their isolation allowed, someone positioned within the human systems that threatened them, who could subtly redirect attention, shift boundaries, influence policy through careful advocacy that never revealed its true motivation. By the time I reached the village where this journey began, I'd made my peace with what needed destroying, understanding that Tenzing's letter had been test as much as invitation, that the Guardian people had evaluated whether our branch of humanity had evolved enough to choose preservation over publication, relationship over exploitation, and my decision would inform whether they attempted future contact or withdrew even deeper, severed the last threads connecting our species, and resigned themselves to parallel extinction. The village elders watched my return with knowing eyes that suggested they understood more than they'd revealed, perhaps descendants of previous messengers, and I saw in their carefully neutral faces the question of whether I'd proven worthy of what the mountains had shown me, whether I could carry forward the covenant or would succumb to our civilization's addiction to exposure and consumption. I destroyed everything on my final night before returning to Kathmandu, wiped drives and exposed film and smashed equipment that had registered impossible readings, kept only the carved stone and my handwritten journals, which I encrypted in language only I could decode, and with each deletion felt grief and liberation intertwined, mourning the career vindication I was sacrificing while celebrating the deeper truth I was protecting, that some mysteries survived only through remaining mysterious, that the guardian people's gift had been trust rather than evidence, and honoring that trust mattered more than any professional validation. I returned to my university position, transformed but unable to explain my transformation, began publishing papers on conservation. Strategies that subtly protected the regions I now knew required protection, joined policy committees where I could influence resource extraction boundaries and protected area designations, became advocate for preservation approaches that recognized indigenous knowledge and restricted human access to fragile ecosystems, never explaining why these particular valleys and peaks required such fierce protection, never revealing that I worked not to preserve abstract wilderness, but to guard living consciousness whose survival maintained balances our species depended on without comprehending. Colleagues commented on my renewed passion. Students noticed the depth of conviction in my ecological frameworks, and nobody suspected I lectured not from theory, but from witnessed truth, that every conservation argument I made served dual purpose. Protecting biodiversity, our science recognized, while simultaneously shielding guardians our civilization couldn't acknowledge without destroying. The carved stone sat on my desk, disguised as ordinary, in paperweight, and some mornings I'd hold it and feel the weight of the choice I'd made, wondering if I'd honored the guardian people's trust or simply chosen comfortable complicity, whether my subtle influence actually protected them or merely delayed inevitable discovery. But then I'd remember that patient presence in their eyes, the way they'd offered choice rather than demand. And I understood that living with uncertainty while working toward preservation was itself the practice they'd modeled, the maintenance of balance without guarantee of outcome. And I'd been granted not burden, but invitation to join consciousness that served continuation rather than conquest, to become translator. Between worlds, keeper of the secret that some of humanity's family had chosen different path, and that path's survival depended on those of us who'd witnessed it finding courage to protect what we couldn't prove, to serve truth too large for evidence, to become guardians ourselves of the guardians who'd been protecting us all along. 23. Years have passed since that expedition, and I'm now recognized as leading voice in Himalayan conservation, credited with establishing protection corridors that preserved 14,000 square kilometers of what colleagues believe is pristine wilderness, but what I know is occupied sanctuary, home to evolutionary branch our species assumes, extinct if we consider it at all. The carved stone remained on my desk through 7 office relocations, handled by countless visitors who admired its craftsmanship without recognizing its significance, and twice I encountered individuals who paused too long when touching it, whose eyes registered something they couldn't articulate, and I wondered if they too carried secrets from the mountains, if the guardian people had contacted others across the decades, building quiet network of protectors who recognized each other through subtle signs. My career flourished specifically because I could never explain my true motivation, forcing me to master conventional arguments about ecosystem services and biodiversity hotspots and climate regulation, becoming more effective advocate than if I'd been able to cite the real stakes. And I understood this was precisely why the Guardians had chosen revelation over continued total concealment, because witness bound by voluntary silence worked harder and smarter than ignorance, because chosen secret created investment that mere policy never could. Some nights I dream of that hidden valley and wake with chest tight with responsibility, wondering if my efforts had been sufficient, if the protections I'd engineered would hold against accelerating resource demands and political pressures, if I'd honored Tenzing's legacy or merely postponed the catastrophe he'd tried to prevent. But then morning would come, and I'd return to the patient incremental work of boundary negotiations and impact assessments, understanding that doubt was companion to any commitment worth making, that certainty would have meant I'd stop truly considering the weight of what I protected. Last month I received diagnosis that makes Tenzing's choice suddenly comprehensible with terrible clarity. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, prognosis measured in months rather than years, and with the news came immediate understanding that I'd become the dying messenger, that the Covenant's weight would soon require transference, that somewhere I needed to identify the next consciousness capable of carrying forward this protection without corruption or exposure. I've spent weeks reviewing my former students, colleagues in the conservation network, researchers whose work demonstrates not just competence, but the particular combination of passion and discretion this guardianship demands, and the selection process has revealed how rare that combination truly is. How many brilliant advocates would immediately seek to document and publicize, would believe sincerely that revelation served protection when it would accomplish the opposite. I've narrowed candidates to 3 individuals, begun the careful process of testing their judgment through hypothetical scenarios and observing their instincts, watching for the particular wisdom that understands some truths serve best through silence, and I've drafted letters that mirror the one Tenzing sent me, cryptic enough to intrigue without exposing, personal enough to command attention, urgent enough to compel action, despite requiring faith in unverified claims. The carved stone will pass to whoever proves worthy, and I've prepared journals encrypted with instructions for accessing the valley, for recognizing the signs the Guardians use to communicate willingness for contact, for understanding the broader context of what they protect and why that protection matters for both our species. And I've included Tenzing's original letter to me, creating lineage of testimony that validates the impossible, that says you are not first and will not be last, that this burden is also privilege, that you've been chosen because you demonstrated capacity for the specific courage this work requires. 2 weeks ago, I returned to Nepal for what I know is final time, made pilgrimage to the village where this journey began, and found it transformed by development I'd been unable to prevent. Paved road now, mobile phone coverage, guest houses for trekkers seeking Himalayan adventure, completely unaware of what watches from the peaks above. The elders who'd witnessed my first return were gone, but their grandchildren showed me the same knowing restraint, and the village's new lama invited me to private conversation where he revealed what I'd long suspected, that certain families had maintained awareness of the guardian people across generations, serving as buffer and early warning system, protecting the secret through cultural frameworks that outsiders dismissed as superstition. And he'd known immediately upon my first return that I'd been accepted into that circle of awareness. He asked directly if I'd chosen successor, and nodded with satisfaction when I confirmed my preparations, then offered prayer that acknowledged both my coming death and my service to what he called the ancient family, the first branch, the patient ones who'd chosen different path and whose continued existence reminded us that human nature wasn't singular, inevitable trajectory, but spectrum of possibilities, that we'd once held potential for different relationship with the living world, and that potential still survived in those who'd maintained it across millennia of our forgetting. We performed ceremony together, burning juniper and speaking names of previous guardians he'd learned from his predecessor, creating oral lineage that stretched back further than either of us could trace. And I added my name, knowing it would be remembered by communities our dominant civilization would never recognize. As record keepers, that I'd become part of story told in mountain villages, whispered testament that some people chose protection over glory, silence over revelation, service over recognition. I returned home carrying peace I hadn't expected to find, understanding finally what Tenzing must have felt in his final months, not regret for the career I might have had if I'd published my findings, but profound gratitude for having been trusted with truth larger than my individual ambition, for having participated however imperfectly in maintenance that mattered, for having served continuation of consciousness that predated our civilization and might, if we succeeded, outlast our worst mistakes. The stone sits before me as I write this final entry, and sometimes in certain light I still see that towering figure moving through snow with impossible grace, still feel the resonance of that vocalization that conveyed grief and gratitude, still carry the weight and wonder of knowing humanity is not alone, not the only inheritors of awareness, not the sole possibility for what intelligence might become. My successor will be chosen within days and will receive the letter that transforms their life as Tenzing's transformed mine, will face the same impossible choice between revelation and protection, between career and covenant, and I trust they'll choose as I did because the Guardian, people's judgment across millennia, has proven reliable, because they've survived our species' expansion by understanding us better than we understand ourselves, by recognizing which among us can evolve beyond our civilization's adolescent need to catalog and control and consume. I will die knowing I kept faith with evolutionary branch that showed me alternative possibility, that chose trust despite every reason for suspicion, that offered not evidence but relationship, and in protecting them I protected part of ourselves we'd forgotten existed, the capacity for wisdom over knowledge, for restraint over exploitation, for recognizing that some mysteries serve us best by remaining forever just beyond our reach, teaching us finally the hardest human lesson, that not everything that exists must be proven, that not everything discovered must be possessed, that the deepest truths sometimes demand not understanding but reverence, not exposure but eternal devoted show who. What would you sacrifice to protect a truth too important to prove? Subscribe to witness more encounters that change everything.